I'm actually part of the U.S. delegation going off to Bonn on actually tomorrow to begin this journey toward Copenhagen. And I really want to commend the work of IFPRI in making sure that agriculture is on the agenda. And I just wanted to make a couple of remarks very briefly and then maybe a question. I think it actually is quite important that agriculture has a seat at the table. And I think Ian pointed out some of the challenges we face, but I think agriculture can play a very constructive role in facilitating agreement. And I think that's true for developed countries where there are cost-effective mitigation options in the ag sector that are going to turn out to be quite important, and that it's going to be important to make sure that we take advantage of all opportunities to reduce emissions and increase carbon sequestration, and that will facilitate movement with developed countries. I think when it comes to developing countries, it's critical to have constructive engagement on terms that are important to developing countries. And when you look at the emissions profile within developing countries, agriculture and land use change are front and center. And so, with regard to engaging developing countries on mitigation, we need to be talking about these things. I really appreciate Jerry's starting off his talk on adaptation, and that's often lost in the shuffle, but it's critical to this. And anything we look at with regard to the land sector has to incorporate adaptation, and again, that's critical to constructively engaging developing countries. I think the last point I wanted to make has to do with the focus on RED, and RED is reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, and its relationship to agriculture. And this is where the question comes in, and I think there is an important relationship. And the question is, what role can agriculture play in reducing pressures on land conversion? And what are the policies and options and techniques that we can use to improve sustainable production within the ag sector, to be able to meet increasing demand from population, but also increasing demand for energy and other uses, while at the same time not exacerbating issues with deforestation.
Okay, thanks. Take 2 or 3 more questions, and then here, and then here, and here. Then we'll do another round. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Charlotte Moser with Ecologic Institute. My question is for Mr. Noble. In terms of the overall commitment of the World Bank towards agriculture, the World Development Report of only a few years ago put agriculture in the front burner as far as development. It was the first time in, I think, 20 years it was actually a focus of the World Development Report. Where is agriculture situated within the climate change agenda that the bank is involved with, particularly the climate investment funds? Is agriculture a component of that? And if you have information about the Global Environment Facility, where is agriculture? These funding mechanisms are being set up now going into Copenhagen, and the bank's input on that could be very important.
Thank you. And then we have one right here.
Okay. I have 2 comments. The first comment I want to make is about the absence of gender in this discussion. The developing countries have established a language of common but differentiated responsibility, and I recognize that has been used for between North and South. But I think that we need to look at that within, we have to take a lens that looks at differential impact and differential responsibility, especially as we look at water and land and the impact that will have on people. Our colleague from South Africa indicated that there is an apartheid effect and impact, and I think that as we look at adaptation and funding and the architecture, the financing, the architecture of financing, we have to look at the differential impact on in terms of infrastructure and how it affects people. Just one last comment that Holland is pouring $10 billion, I understand, into adaptation because effect of the sea on agriculture and on its well-being, and poor countries and women within communities won't be able to adapt accordingly. And the second thing I wanted to do was CDM and Ian Noble. The clean development mechanism, you call it the Volkswagen of adaptation or something like that. You said it's not the Cadillac but the Volkswagen. And my question is, for whom though? Because we know that countries such as India and China and some Latin American countries have been able to access that, but to a large extent poor countries don't have the institutions and the mechanisms to be able. So for agriculture we need a different CDM.
I have one more in front, then I'll turn it back and then start from there in the next round. There, any? Okay, well, okay. All right, so one more here, and then we'll turn it to the panel, and then.
Jonathan Haskett, World Agroforestry Center. I think that one potential unifying conceptual framework is to look at the potential for high carbon stock sustainable development. I think that there's a huge potential in terms of degraded landscapes and other landscapes in the developing world in which you can actively combine increasing the carbon stocks on the landscape with very real sustainable and adaptation benefits. And I think that looking at where we are now in those landscapes and what we need to do, or what are some of the potential scenarios and pathways that we could set those landscapes onto a trajectory of high carbon stock sustainable development, is critical. And I think that that combines both the mitigation and the adaptation and the sustainable development aspects. And I think this should be looked at explicitly. Thank you.
Thanks. Can we turn it to the panel now? Ian, do you want to start? And then we'll work back.
Okay. Yeah, there's a number of things there. Firstly, we're commenting on Bill's point about the leadership from the developed countries in some of these activities. I fully agree, and I think that's one of the core issues. And also, I think it's the US is actually in a very good position to do that because they've been very long behind that particular approach. The issue about the CDM not being the Cadillac, that I must have made myself didn't make myself very clear in that. The Rolls-Royce and Volkswagen was about the methodologies, not the CDM. But going back to your core point about the CDM, I mean, the CDM has been a very valuable mechanism for a number of developing countries, but as you make the point, it's not been very effective for a number of other countries who just don't have the energy options that can be used. I think it is important that we do find ways that there can be effective flows. I think we do have to have the discussion, though, whether the CDM, as it is at the moment, is the right way to do that, whether it will ever deliver enough. And I think we have to, there are talk about moving the CDM to more programmatic approaches. Yes, that can work in the energy sector. It has some application in the non-energy, I'll call them the land-based sectors, but again, it may not be the most efficient and effective way. And that's why I touched upon the point, and I think others have touched upon it as well, the idea of linking the adaptation and mitigation agendas, I think is probably the way to go. This gentleman here just referred to high stock sustainable development. I almost fully agree, except that I don't like the term high carbon stock. I tend to talk about increasing carbon stock, only because when people hear high stock, they immediately think, rainforests. And I think it's important we take many of our some of the degraded lands, some of our, not necessarily degraded, but some of the less carbon-intense savannas and rangelands, and look at how we can improve the carbon stocks in those areas as well, because I think that's just as important. Maybe not quite so much numerically for carbon, but it's very, very important for the people in those lands. I think that's the only tweak I'd make on that point. And I try to balance that with low carbon intensity development, which the energy people keep on talking about. I think we need to put the two together. Thanks. Agriculture in the bank. Within the... firstly, I'll comment there. I see some of my agricultural colleagues here, and they might want to comment more directly in a much more informed way on what the bank is doing in this area. Firstly, the bank itself is looking very, very intensely into this whole issue of the role of agricultural emissions in the and uptakes in the negotiations, so that there's a strong engagement there. Under the CIF, the Climate Investment Funds, there is opportunities for agriculture to be taken up in a couple of the existing ones, the pilot program on climate resilience, or the adaptation component. There is, of course, a forest component being developed at the moment. Whether that will continue through to be an agricultural component as well, or whether it be a separate path, I think is uncertain at the moment, but is certainly under consideration. And all I can say is really, and others might want to add to this, is that we're very much aware, just as we've heard in this discussion, of the importance of agriculture in this whole process.
Fiwe?
Yeah, one thing I would like also to emphasize is that, yes, there has been absence of gender in these discussions, and which is very much unfortunate, because also, as you know, that women and children, especially also in the developing countries, they are at the forefront of experiencing the impacts of climate change. I think also it's going also to be important that also not just the chapter, but also that the gender also become fully engaged and also fully involved in the as we develop, especially on the adaptation chapter, which may be perhaps also that's where then it could fit in. And also the issues of disparities. I think also it's one of the issues also which we see, and also which I think we have to address. I see also the mitigation of both on greenhouse effect also have been also a condition of how then positively also do we get engaged and then and use that positively, and see also what comes out into the negotiations on how we develop it in such a way that we see how we can use it effectively.
Well, I plan to spend this year focused like a laser beam on agriculture in the Copenhagen negotiations. I mean, I think if you read the documents, there is an appalling lack of that word in pretty much anything that you read, which is what we need to reverse. And if we don't get the word in the outcome in a number of key places, exactly how it goes in there, I'm an economist, not a diplomat, so I wouldn't have a clue how to get it in there exactly. But if we don't get it in there at all, then we'll end up with a situation like we did with the Kyoto round, where several things, potential promising things, were basically left off the table. So get agriculture in the words of the negotiations. Exactly how, I leave it up to the diplomats and the politicians. So that's the sort of the first key message I think we need to take away from this. Other things that are related to agriculture, I will hope will fall out naturally once we get agriculture included in the negotiation. And I would say, for example, gender is an example of this. If you don't think about women when you're thinking about agriculture, then you're just kind of missing the whole point, basically. And that what those roles are depends on where you are in the world. So let me say a couple of other comments. The issue of I have taken an oath to start all of my presentations with an emphasis on data. Our data sources are bad, their data collection efforts are underfunded, and they need dramatic improvements. And it's not the traditional data sets only. That's part of the problem. We need to get some different data sets. Let me just give you an example of the different kind of data sets. Fiwe talked about local adaptation. You know, the thing about local adaptation is that there are people around the world who've experienced particular kind of climates and have adapted to those kind of climates today that other people will be facing in the future. So that we need to collect data on those efforts, and so that we can transfer them around the world as climates evolve in different ways going forward. The last thing I would say has to do with mitigation and offsets. You know, the carbon exchange in Chicago has been paying for soil carbon offsets in the United States, paying for soil carbon mitigation in the U.S., and I think that the technologies can be transferred to the developing world, I think there's some interesting public-private partnerships that we could imagine to deal with this whole bulking or aggregation issue that is part of the reason why there's some reluctance to think about mitigation. But I think we need to get agriculture in the mitigation side so that we can then have the incentive to move forward on the development of those partnerships and the development of the technologies to actually do MERV, the monitoring and verification. Because if it's not included, then there will be less pressure to actually do those technology developments and do those data collection efforts.
If I could just add one word also on the gender issue. And the evidence that we are doing a fairly comprehensive review of the evidence on the impact of climate variability and potential climate change on women, and it is, I'm sure you probably know, it is clear that women and children are at much higher risk. They suffer more from extreme climate events such as drought, and to date, in most carbon offset projects, they have not been well represented in the negotiation process. So that is a key point. So I already have a list that starts in the back there, and I'll add this gentleman in the back then. Yeah. So I'm there, here, and back there. And okay. So start. Yeah, you're up. Sorry. Yes.
Thanks very much. Charlotte Hebebrand with the International Food and Agricultural Trade Policy Council. Congratulations to IFPRI for putting this together. I have the feeling this is going to be the first of many climate change agriculture conferences in this town. I want to make two comments. One is on the importance of an open trade system. I think Jerry made the point very well and also pointed out the irony that just as we're saying trade becomes very important in the context of climate change, the Doha negotiations are going nowhere. I think trade is not only going to matter in terms of getting food to places that perhaps can no longer grow it, it also should play a role in, if you want to think about it, in sort of comparative environmental advantages. I mean, we should really be growing food where we have the water, where we have the land, not in places where it's going to do more damage. So I think their trade will play a crucial role to sort of get that moving in the right way. The irony is not only that the Doha round is not going anywhere, but I think also that some consumer and environmental groups are actually arguing that trade is bad for the environment by focusing exclusively on the greenhouse gas emissions that are occurring through transportation. And again, I would urge all of us to really take a much bigger look at this and look at entire life cycle analysis when we look at these questions. I also have to wonder how this group feels about the latest statements coming out of on the U.S. side. You're all aware that the new Secretary of Agriculture has said to U.S. producers, you need to start looking towards environmental payments for your future support. And I think on the one hand, that is very heartening because I think it goes to the point that agriculture does play a very important role in climate change mitigation, and that perhaps there's a way that that can be enhanced further. But I think in the context of developed versus developing countries and the reality that funds at the end of the day are going to be limited, I think that we can make available for adaptation, there will be pressure to look to markets to do this kind of thing. And then the question is, how do we ensure that developing country producers can benefit from some of these incentives in the same way that perhaps developed countries can? Because certainly the technology, the measures to implement new agricultural practices presumably are easier to be had in countries like the U.S. Thank you.
And this gentleman right here is next. I have a list of about 5 people. You're on it, and then we'll bring it back.
Tim Johns from Biodiversity International at McGill University. My question actually relates to the last speaker. Perhaps our perspectives are different, but I guess the main question would be, should we not be looking at, and do we not need to look at agriculture within terms of the larger food system, particularly when thinking about the cost of transports of food, the cost of agriculture, the % what it contributes in terms of carbon balance we've seen, but transport is certainly an additional point on top of that. If from that perspective, then international trade, increased international trade, although necessary, may be a necessary evil. And that, in that regard, the emphasis of Gerald and of Sifiwe on more local solutions would seem to be even more compelling.
Mark, right over there.
Good morning. My name is Mark Kackler with the World Bank's Agriculture Department. Thanks to Mark, to IFPRI, and to the panelists. With respect to the World Bank, I mean, the World Bank is not a monolithic place, but I think Ian was absolutely right. From Bob Zellick, who's now in his speeches talking about soil carbon and the reason why that has to be in Copenhagen, on down to those of us lower in the food chain. Last month we had a conference on soil carbon. I learned a new acronym, REAL, Reduced Emissions from Agricultural Landscapes, as a companion to RED. I hope we'll be hearing more about that in the future. And so I think we probably all agree that agriculture, including mitigation, has to be in Copenhagen. But how so? And here, Jerry, I want to take issue with something you said. I mean, what you spoke about, and this flyer is terrific because of its emphasis on suggested negotiating outcomes. But where I take issue is that maybe the words don't matter. I actually think the words matter very, very much. Because if we come out of Copenhagen with simply a recognition that agriculture is important, that's not good enough. And that didn't happen in Kyoto with respect to forestry. And I think that's one of the reasons why we lost so many years. I mean, you're suggesting negotiate outcome on allowing innovative payment mechanisms. That's what's important. And we come out of Copenhagen with permission to put these things into effect. And simply saying it's important won't be good enough, but actually including language that permits. There's no way we're going to have deals before Copenhagen on a lot of this stuff. That's recognizable. But what's not recognized yet is it's important to leave the door open explicitly for such mechanisms to come into play in the coming years. Thanks.
Thank you. Then you have one in front, then the one right there, and then the lady in back, and then we need to move it.
Yeah, this is Martin van Nieuwkamp, also the World Bank. I'm wondering to what extent that distinction between adaptation and mitigation for agriculture is not a kind of a superficial distinction. I mean, if you look at some of the measures, I mean, that can be taken in agriculture to deal with climate change, such as crop residue management, reduced tillage, I mean, cover crops. I mean, those both have an element, or an element of adaptation, as well as mitigation. And it's quite interesting to see that the first speaker actually, when you look at the slides, the first speaker actually put those practices as part of mitigation, while the second speaker actually put those practices as part of adaptation. So there's kind of confusion among ourselves here, and I'm wondering if that's being recognized, that distinction is superficial, that actually makes it easier actually to put agriculture up as part of the mitigation agenda.
Okay, right back here.